Hey and welcome to Rauta's Worst to Best videos. This time a rather peculiar case with a Norwegian black metal artist known as Ildjarn. Not only is an artist but also a band is called Ildjarn, well technically a solo project. But why this is worth mentioning is that, well, Ildjarn, the artist, also had this other project called Ildjarn Nidhogg and Sort of Vokta, which are then again kind of side projects to Ildjarn. Now Sort Vokta is a little bit of a, say, side adventure to Ildjarn, very much similar in style but still a little bit different. Then again, worth mentioning in this context, and that is something that I previously did true with my classic reviews, so you might want to check it out. Also, Ildjarn Nidhogg is a little bit of a different side adventure once again, because there are lots of similarities with the style, but since it's not Ildjarn's side, solo project, but a side adventure, side project, it is not included in this Worst to Best. So it might sound a little bit confusing because all these three different bands of sorts are kind of married or tied to each other, linked, connected, whatever you're gonna call it, and there are lots of same genetics in a way, metaphorically speaking. But in this Worst to Best, I'm just gonna focus on Ildjarn solo stuff and of course the albums. Now if you watched my previous Worst to Best video with Celtic Frost, I already kind of described this curve which bands have with their careers. Like some go up and down, you know, having hits and misses. Some go more on, you know, kind of incline, you know, getting better over the years, maybe then turning more into these waves. And some bands just go up and then come down. There are plenty of examples of these kind of stuff. And as the stories with Celtic Frost, they have a little bit of a different letter to describe their career. Ildjarn, then again, is very, very different from most bands in this respect. And as such, it's definitely worth describing. I'll do my best, but you might not fully agree. Of course, that's kind of a given. Also, this might not make sense to you at all, especially if you're not as familiar with the music as I claim to be. I'm using the word claim because, I mean, I've been listening to this band quite a lot over the years, but then again, there was a lot of years when I didn't exactly have time to go through all this. But as to refresh my memories and put it in a sort of a kind of a order, well, obviously I had to do a little bit of a listening. And I'm still not sure, 100% sure, if this is the actual order of things to go, because, well, the quality is not that different from album to album, except one exception, and I'll describe that in one bit. Now, Ildjarn is officially said to be having the career as this solo project from 1991 to 2005. Technically speaking, we're mostly talking about early and mid-90s, because after that, nothing really happened in terms of album-wise anyway, after 1996. You see these compilations here in Metal Archive site, you see these EPs, which I guess are the reasons why, technically speaking, Ildjarn is mentioned to have until 2005. But as far as it comes to full-length albums, and in my opinion the best release by Ildjarn is this Det frusende Nordriket compilation from 1995. Well, that kind of explains that the band was basically mostly operating, you know, around mid-90s, including the demos, which then again have also early 90s vibes. What is also worth mentioning with Ildjarn is sometimes he's kind of overlooked as a black metal artist coming from Norway. I mean, he has been in Emperor and Untitled Chapter, which then again is kind of a predecessor band for so many black metal bands, or extreme metal bands in Norway. But Ildjarn kind of decided to go different ways. Instead of becoming one of those artists, you know, going big in a way, he went other paths, and I can only respect that decision. He went way more, say, extreme ways than any of these other bands coming from Norway. Well, mostly anyway. And he did so much more extreme, raw, primitive black metal than none of these guys could probably understand or get it going. And what is worth mentioning is that it's kind of funny to take a look at these review scores on average in Metal Archives. I mean, none of these albums are exactly boasting with big numbers, and I get it. This is marginal music for marginal people. So it's kind of like having 67% for the debut or 50% for Strength and Anger. I can totally understand it. Some people are gonna take this as pile of steaming shit. For me, quite the opposite. I am an Ildjarn fan, and I can say I like basically everything he made, you know, metal-wise. But that's a different story what other people think. I'm here to just give my worst to best for Ildjarn. Now the style is very much what I described already. Raw, primitive, relentless black metal in ways that most black metal bands can only dream of. And by dreaming I mean many black metal bands probably think they are very, very raw and that they, you know, do something very fierce and violent and all that kind of stuff. But let's be honest about it. Most black metal seem like mainstream, basic metal thing. Even rock and roll compared to what Ildjarn was doing. And that's part of the charm. I mean, whether we're talking about his raw production or his vocals or riffs used, well, I think this is one of the rawest black metal bands and still being of quality band, you know, big time. But it's not all the way true, just raw black metal. There is one exception to the rule during these full-length albums, and that is, in my opinion, also the weakest one in Ildjarn discography. That's called Landscapes from 1996. Now, mind you, as you might have noticed, all these albums are pretty much released, technically speaking, the same year, but that doesn't really tell when these were recorded. I mean, there's probably something bizarre going on about releases getting out at the same time, basically. But, you know, as the things usually are, some of the releases have been recorded or visualized, created in different spans. I mean, people have been saying that about Burzum, like, the early album wasn't exactly the earliest of material, so sometimes things go in a different ways, and that's not the only band out there. Anyway, we're going on with the official release date, so let's just leave it at that. But Landscapes is here as my worst of Ildjarn releases, and in my opinion, it's the only one that is not exactly good. Now, this one comes in two albums, which are both over 60 minutes long. The first one being over 70 minutes, and the second, well, about an hour. And all these instrumental tracks, which have no names, are much like kind of ambient. It's very, very much a line drawn in water, like very vague, where synthesizer music ends and where it becomes ambient. Sometimes people call Burzum's synthesizer albums just ambient, and some people call them dungeon synth. That's up for debate, but in my opinion, Landscapes are definitely more in the ambient sector versus being just synthesizer music. And we're not even talking about synth wave here, because these are songs which are not exactly melodic as such, which don't have these kind of rhythmic patterns. They're more about just creating these spaces filled with synths, but not exactly anything memorable is happening. It's not like these songs are like different parts, like it starts with this kind of riff or melody and goes to this part or this bridge or chorus part. There is no structure like that, and that at the same time makes this whole double album quite fascinating and also quite boring. Now, I just happen to be a big dark ambient fan, and by dark ambient I really mean it's dark, it's even scary sometimes. It's like music creating the images of horror and terror and going beyond the sanity of man. I'm talking about Cthulhu and visions of first Alien movie, which are really, really scared, like horror movie stuff without actually being horror movie soundtracks. Even scarier than most of the horror stuff. But that's not what Landscapes is all about. It's more about what this cover image is all about. Creating music which fits the landscape. Kind of beautiful and at the same time very amorphous, like as if it doesn't really have a form or shape. It's more about colors going into different places and, you know, just mixing and meshing each other, like as if you really can't say where it ends and where it starts. And the whole album is like that. This could be one lengthy track going all over these places, blending these colors together and being very, very vague with its style. Now, some people might like this a lot, especially if you're looking for really soothing music without rhythm patterns, without vocals, without melodies and all that stuff. And why I would label this more ambient rather than synthesizer music having these melodies or drum machine parts or any kind of drums, which technically speaking is happening with Ildjarn, Nidhogg project Hardanger Vidda, and that has these rhythmic patterns. It's kind of like related to landscapes, but also a little bit more kind of annoying at the same point because it has these kind of a drum machine parts. These are very much like the same and yet they're very much separate. And anyway, this is the reason why this is, in my opinion, the weakest one of Ildjarn and something that I would consider a mediocre release. Not bad, but it's not something that I can really get the proper feeling out of it. Some people might, but for me, it's the weakest of Ildjarn. Rest assured. Now, the rest of these three albums, Ildjarn, debut album 1995, Ildjarn and Forest Border 1996, they're all the raw black metal that really kept me thinking and saying this is one of the better black metal bands of all time coming from Norway. Not the best, not the second best, but still something that I can totally like because no weak album whatsoever was made. Not even a mediocre one if you just remove landscapes out of the equation, that being not a metal release in the first place. Now this is hard for me to put these into proper order because I like them all pretty much equally. But I guess in order to make some kind of order here, I would say Forest Poetry would be the number 3 slot. Why so? Because it's basically continuing where the first album left off. It's an album with short tracks, as you can see, 52 minutes, almost 22 tracks. Some of the tracks are just as short as 1 minute, mostly 2 minutes or so. So these are not exactly songs that are very long. They're very simple, very primitive, very raw. All Ildjarn components are here. The production is very raw, and it's not like any given instrument, any part of the production is like, hey, this is pretty cool. In fact, it's not cool, and that's kind of the point of it. This is nothing to do with this kind of a forest poetry, which might make you to believe this is something of a, I don't know, atmospheric black metal or beautiful melodic and all that stuff. This is sturdy, this is violent, this is pure primitiveness in a way that whatever you think is caveman kind, this is even more. This is like going back to the beyond Iron Age and all that stuff. And this is like nature itself is giving the black metal some kind of a bloom. And it's not like, hey, it must be colorful, nice plants and all that shit. No, it's not. It's sturdy, it's kind of a gloomy, it's kind of a violent, and it makes you feel like that Panzerfaust by Darkthrone is actually a nice sounding album. And that's part of the charm here, really. Not for everybody, but I really like this. I would say this is an 8 out of 10 album. Why not so much more? Because it's kind of gets monotone along the ways, and it's not really catchy album in that sense. But I do really like these riffs, and I don't know if better production, by better I mean more clear, crisp, powerful, would make much of sense. It is part of the Ildjarn sound and feel to be raw and primitive. Can't really put it beyond that. I mean, you could talk for hours about that, but it wouldn't make any sense. Now the second slot. Now this is kind of a tricky also because Forest Portrait could be really the second one, but I decided to pick Strength and Anger over that. Partially because it's the most primitive, the rawest of all Ildjarn albums. Now, as you can see, most of the tracks are considered instrumental. Beyond that, this 73 minutes of an album has a couple of weird ambient tracks. Black Anger, Hate Meditation 1 and Midnight Strength, Black Anger, Hate Meditation 2, which are in fact these kind of a very minimal ambient tracks. So it's as if this decided to include these hate meditation tracks to kind of balance things out. The others are ultra raw and ultra primitive stuff, which is just tear you into pieces. And then you have these very simple, very monotone ambient tracks, as if to balance things out. Violent and primitive and raw, and then again very, very soothing in a way, or really dark in a way, to make this kind of a weird album. I know a person, a colleague of mine, who does a lot of black metal reviews and interviews, and he says this is the best Ildjarn album. But I think people like him and me are some of the few ones who actually really like this kind of stuff. It's hard to say why this album is so fascinating, because really none of these tracks are that good as, you know, individual ones. You kind of need a little bit of time to get into this mindset of Ildjarn and Strength of an Anger, because it's so raw, so unpolished, so caveman-like, that it takes a little bit of time to kind of make your brain adjust to this kind of stuff. It's almost like it's kind of a demo collection in a way, and still it sounds more raw and more powerful and primitive than most demos out there, because it doesn't really sound like it's homemade crappy recording. It's like intentionally really raw and primitive, and it makes even kind of early version recordings sound like, hey, this is actually quite nice. So in order to just understand Ildjarn, you need to have maybe a little bit loose screws in your head. I don't know, if I feel like totally like that, because this is something really, really crazy material out there, and I like it. And this is also some of the material I compare other raw and primitive bands with. You know, I take those raw and primitive albums and then what would Ildjarn do with it? How would it compare it to this one? But really, it's my second favorite Ildjarn in that sense. But like I said, this could be, you know, First Portrait and Strength of an Anger could switch places and nothing would really be that different. Then again, we have 1995 Ildjarn debut, Ildjarn. Why this is the first one? Well, once again, 27 tracks, 75 minutes. It's crazy, because this already kind of introduced us to the raw and primitive black metal, what Ildjarn was later on to be, and what it's most known for. Now, the reason why I decided to put this as the first spot is maybe that this is a little bit better in songwriting than the ones coming later on, and also comparing First Portrait, this one is more like it really didn't renew the pattern so much. It's more like continuing where Ildjarn left off. Strength and Anger is a little bit different, but mostly because of its ambient tracks. All these three albums are like siblings to each other. They're like brothers and sisters, basically. So putting this above those two, well, I don't know if there is that big a difference. Now, if those two would be more like 8 out of 10 for me, I would say this is 8.5 out of 10. So the difference is not big, but it's, I guess, worth mentioning. This started the whole deal here, and pretty much what I said about the style, being primitive, being violent, being raw, being right to the point, being like this spiked club, where other bands are more like machine guns, you know, like Marduk, going fast and kind of a tech. And, you know, some bands are more like revolvers, Magnum 44, powerful and simple. Well, Ildjarn brings this, you know, spiked club to the fight, where everybody else is just landing these magnificent pieces of craftsmanship, you know, weapons and guns in different sizes and designs. Ildjarn is that spiked club. Everybody else is like, that is barbaric. That is raw. That is that primitive thing. I don't want to go near to this weird beast, this creature that is no human at all. And that's part of the charm, once again. So, 4 albums all in all, of which one is an ambient track. Kind of hard to put into different order, but in case you kind of had to do it, this would be mine. But like I said, if I had to take only one Ildjarn release of all times with me, and I couldn't touch the others after that, I would actually pick the Frusende Nordriket compilation, because that is the best of all the Ildjarn stuff. But that's not an album, but a compilation, so it's not really qualified for this for worst to best. Now, if I piqued your interest to check out Ildjarn with this worst to best video, I hope that you give it a fair chance, maybe even revisit it in case you have listened to it previously. I think it's worth its time. An interesting band for sure, or project, and even that Soltvokter and Ildjarn Nidhogg, they're interesting projects as well. Totally underrated of all Norwegian names in my opinion. So I hope to do a little bit of justice to this particular band or project with this video. I hope you will give it a chance. And to my positive surprise, I found the albums on Spotify. So you don't even have to chase those rare CDs or whatever in order to get your Ildjarn going. You can find it on stream services. So I hope you will give it a chance and I hope you will like it. This is Rauta, this is Jerry, Hails, and see you again with more worst to best videos coming your way.